Good evening, everyone, and welcome to MLA's Productivity and Profitability webinar series. These webinars are designed to deliver topics pertinent to beef, sheep, and goat producers. My name is Hilary, and I work for the Webinar Coordinators Home Sacket. Tonight's webinar is presented by Dr. Alison Gunn, discussing the causes, treatment, and control of calf scours. Just a bit of housekeeping to begin with. This is the control panel and will be at the top right-hand corner of your screen. The red arrow on the left collapses and reinstates the control panel. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. Please type your questions in the box provided as Alison goes throughout her presentation this evening. I will relay the questions to Alison at the end of the webinar. I will also note that these webinars are recorded and are available at a later date on the MLA website. I'm delighted to introduce a new presenter tonight in Dr. Alison Gunn. My bio is not coming up. Alison is a veterinarian who has worked in the beef and dairy industry in Australia for nearly 30 years. She has a passion for calves and has investigated many calf scours outbreaks, as well as researched, published, and provided technical advice to industry on calves and calf scours. From 2004 until 2014, she was the project manager for a series of MLA projects on calf scours in suckler beef herds. Currently, she runs a veterinary consulting business, Herd Solutions, based in East Gippsland, and coordinates 3 Better Beef Network groups in the Gippsland area. So there's no better person to be presenting this topic tonight, and I will just make Alison the presenter to get started.
Hello, Hilary. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear. Thanks, Alison.
Yep. Okay, hello, everybody else. And yes, it is a topic I'm very passionate about, and I'll just try and not talk too much about it because anyone that knows me knows I can talk about calf scours. Okay, so what this webinar is about I could talk about calf scours on your farm, have an idea about what meaningful calf scours diagnosis is, a knowledge of effective treatment, and I also want to talk about using antibiotics. Get rid of that little. I think that calf scours could be quite pertinent this season. We know that calf scours waxes and wanes, and we get some seasons are bad and some that aren't. And certainly there's areas of Australia that are blessed with some really good rainfall. But that might mean that they're more likely to have more of those diseases around that look like that wetter weather, and calf scours can be one of those. The other thing is with the herd rebuilding, there's people will have brought in animals from other herds, and that will have also meant they've brought in new pathogens, which they may not.
Alison, sorry.
I really wanted.
You're just dropping in and out a little bit. I'm not sure what's happened since I spoke to you when we started. You're just fading in and out every now and then. Yeah, I've lost you. Sorry.
Okay, no idea. I haven't done anything, Hilary. Oh, I know. Wait. Is that working, Hilary?
Yeah, that seems to be better now. We'll see how we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, much better.
Okay. I think I know what the issue was. It's called bandwidth, I think. So basically, understanding calf scours. So calf scours is, it's a problem that's most common in calves less than 6 weeks of age. surveillance in New South Wales at that later stage of 4 to 12 weeks. Some of the more extensive herds that don't see their calves all the time should always consider calf scours if you get losses between pregnancy testing and weaning of more than 5%. And because it's a multifactorial disease, which we'll talk about, means lots of things impact it. There's a large variation in losses between herds and from year to year, as I mentioned earlier. So what are the impacts? Well, calf scours is really time consuming. One study showed that it can take 85 minutes per calf for producers to treat their beef calves. It is incredibly frustrating. I've had many producers in tears on the phone when I've done surveys on calf scours. The time, the fact, getting up every morning, finding more sick calves, having to treat them, that it's just a very, very disease that takes over some people's lives at calving. It therefore affects their mental well-being, and obviously it has animal welfare impacts, and it is expensive. So not going to go into this in great detail, but basically there's measurable losses, so your cost of your calf, replacing that, the cost of treatment, and there's also a number of non-measurable losses, such as the impact of the growth rate and the loss of genetic potential. The cost to the industry, a study I did back in 2003, 46, these were effective producers, so people that had more of a problem. It was costing them $18.70 per day per breeding animal, which is $27 in today's terms. That was including estimates for all the measurable losses. And the range was as low as 70%, but in some herds was over $100 per cow. So if you got a large herd, that's a lot of dollars. And that was also showed up when they did the priority list of endemic diseases, where it came up as number 5, and most of the other diseases are northern diseases. The other interesting thing to notice there is that that is only looking at the production cost, but obviously there's also treatment costs and prevention costs if you're going to put in place good preventive strategies. So just some data I pulled out from those 46 herds, and this is a little while ago, but I don't think things will have changed. And what it showed is that down here, most of these animals in the bottom left-hand corner, most of these herds in the bottom left-hand corner had less than 20% affected and less than 2% mortality. So that was the bulk of the herd. But there were quite a lot of herds with 20% of their animals, calves, affected over the calving season, and up to over 10% mortality. And there was also a couple of herds out here which had a large number of affected calves, even though their losses were lower. So really variable and can have a massive impact. Studies have also showed, these are representative surveys of all farmers rather than the study I did, which was people that rang in and said, I've got a problem. 16% considered the condition significant on their herd. 50% in a different study had scours on their farm. Mortality of 1.5% in calves aged 6 to 20 days of age, and 8% failed to thrive after scouring, so they go on to not do very well. And that was backed up by a study that came out in the last few months looking at Cryptosporidia, and all these calves are crypto, but some of them were severely affected and some of them showed no clinical signs. And the ones that were severely affected were 34 kilos lighter than the calves with no clinical signs of infection when they reached 6 months of age. So big impact there on their weight gain if you get significantly affected calves. The calves that were significantly affected had scours for more than 3 days, and they also were obviously moribund and needed treatment. They weren't just running around. So it was a significant impact, but it did have a big impact on their weight gain. So what causes calf scours? Well, rotavirus and bovine coronavirus, very topical virus, are the two most common viruses. There are a number of other lesser viruses, Pestivirus can also have an impact by reducing the immune system. If there is a persistently infected calf in your herd, then that may exacerbate the other viruses around. Then there's 2 protozoa that we say are commonly infected. Well, there's actually 3, but the most common one is Cryptosporidia, as I've mentioned. Another one that has some impact is the thing called Giardia, and then coccidiosis is much more of a problem at that greater than 4-week age stage, and more of a problem in laboratory diagnostics in New South Wales. And then there's 2 significant bacteria. There's E. coli. There's E. coli in all the feces, but a specific one called ETEC. There are other coliforms associated with calf scours in Australia, but they are much less commonly diagnosed, and Salmonella. The important thing to remember is that generally there's more than one pathogen involved in your herd. It's a bit like when your kids go to kindy, there's lots of bugs floating around. Most herds have got several of these bugs, and when they really cause a problem is when you've got calves with 2 or 3 of these pathogens acting at the same time. And certainly both from diagnostic lab data and from my experience, Cryptosporidia is certainly one that will be much more likely to make the calves sick. Okay, so the key to understanding and preventing calf scours is to understand the disease. And so here's the most important points. The pathogens are shed by the calving cows and older calves. And shedding will increase at calving because the cow's immunity decreases. So she comes up to calving, she suddenly starts shedding bugs that she may not have had been shed since she was almost a calf, and that includes coronavirus, which I think is a little scary, personally. And so as you go through calving, there's a more and more build-up of bugs on your calving paddocks, and so it's towards the end of calving we normally see a problem. The pathogens can survive in the environment for quite a long time. So once you get an outbreak, you get cows that start shedding, the calves pick it up, they start shedding it, you get a rapid buildup of pathogens in the environment. And most of those pathogens can survive in the environment for weeks or even months, and in some cases for over a year when it's cool, damp conditions. And interestingly, things like crypto and rotavirus are more commonly a problem in southern Australia, where it's often a bit cooler, not maybe recently, and further north, they don't seem to survive from year to year. Another important thing to remember is that the younger the calf, the smaller dose of pathogen it needs to cause a disease. So it's really important when preventing it to protect those very young calves. So your newborns, your calves from heifers, and calves that have got low immunity, which is generally calves that have not received enough colostrum. So what are the principles for minimizing calf scours? There's 3 of them. Minimize your contact between young calves, those less than 4 weeks of age, and potential sources of infection. Maximize the colostrum intake, calf welfare, and nutrition during the first 6 weeks of life. And avoid the introduction of new calf scour pathogens into the herd. So a classic one there is probably someone that loses a calf and then goes to get a dairy calf from down the road and brings a heaps of bugs with them. Okay, so when you're looking at calf scours, prevention can be costly and time consuming as well as treatment. And it's important to actually look at the risk and look at your herd. Consider how often you get calf scours over a number of years. What is the herd immunity doing? You'll find it waxes and wanes. Often people find they get calf scours for 2 or 3 years and it goes away again. As I said earlier, seasonal variation is common. So in New South Wales, it seems to be October, November when it's hot and the flies are around. You get a hot, humid break and you'll get more calf scours. Certainly wetter weather. And even if you got scouring animals, how many of them are actually needing treatment and dying? Because calves often run around with a bit of diarrhea, but they're actually not sick, and it's just those bugs working their way through the system, the same as kids with snotty noses. You need to assign a level of risk and dollars. And a dollar value to your boost control method going to work on you. As I said, they could, the preventive strategies could be more expensive than a potential loss. So you're developing a risk-based protocol, and you need to consider your time of calving, how long you're calving for, your grazing management, how much feed you might have, to actually sit down and plan how you're going to manage calving, especially if you're trying to prevent calf scours. For many herds, calf scours may be a minor problem and you might not want to go to these lengths. It's often good to have a good herd management calendar anyhow, but certainly if you've got a, that's where you need to start. Procedural manuals, SOPs are always good things to have, as well as having a good forward feed budget, because knowing how much grass you've got is important, especially if you need to manage different mobs of cattle to control your calf scours. You need to have some triggers for action when you get an outbreak or when you think you need to put a control measure in for the next season. So the percentage of calves requiring treatment in the last month, if it suddenly increases, if it goes over 4%, you might decide time to put a control measure in. If you've got a lot of deaths, or your deaths last year were between 1 and 28 days, and the first month of life were greater than 3%. If you've got calves born alive, but they're dying between 1 and 6 months of age, and you've got more than 2% of those, that could be another trigger. Or if you don't have those sort of statistics, those between birth and weaning, if that's more than 5%, again, calf scours may be a problem in your herd. So the first thing you need to do is minimize contact with potential sources of infection. So that's your calving cows, your sick calves, your calves greater than 4 weeks of age. Obviously, it's pretty hard to keep calves away from calving cows, but you can keep newborn calves and move them away from the calving cows. Wet and muddy areas are a lovely source of all sorts of pathogens and should be avoided. And obviously, if calves are nibbling at surfaces that have got manure, if they're somewhere that's not very clean, you put them in yards or you leave them in the yard for a while to mother up with a heifer that doesn't want her, then there's an increased risk. So if you're forward planning, you actually need to be thinking where your calving and nursery paddocks are going to be 12 months in advance, because you need to be thinking what is going in there before calving that may be increasing the risk. So you don't want to be having young calves. If you've got a split calving, you actually want to have older animals in those calving paddocks in the months before calving comes up, or sheep as another option. If you've had a calf scours outbreak last year, you want to try and avoid those paddocks in the next year. Sometimes that can be pretty hard, but these pathogens definitely remain in the paddocks from year to year. Heifers especially, they're going to be more stressed if you introduce them to the cows and then start calving. So when they're stressed, they're more likely to shed pathogens, and calving's stressful enough anyhow. So keep your heifers and the heifer calves away from the cows. Have your heifers somewhere where you can manage them if you need to, and the cows that hopefully need a lot less intervention can be further away. Have your calving paddocks fresh so that the cows go in it within a few days of calving, not weeks beforehand. And you need to have more than one calving paddock, because after a few weeks you will get those build-up of pathogens. You start getting an increase, you need to move those calving cows or cows due to calve into a different paddock. And that needs to be done more frequently if the paddocks are wet and boggy. Water is important. Clean water can be a source of Cryptosporidium. Also, water needs to be available for calves to drink. I'm really strong on this. I had a calf scour outbreak in the last year. The only access in this particular paddock the calves had was a really steep, muddy dam, which they couldn't even get down to. This particular producer had cows calving in multiple places on this farm, but the only place the calf scales was a real problem was in the only paddock that didn't have reticulated water. Mud building up around troughs where calves sniff around can also be a problem, as can supplementary feeding sites. You need to move where you feed your hay, because as you can see in a blow up of that picture, and I'm sure you've noticed, the calves love to go and lie in that hay. So if you've got the calves hanging around the same area where the cows are feeding and dunging, then you're going to have an increased risk of infection. So let's go on a little world tour to Nebraska. Could say coronavirus capital, because they've certainly got more of it than us at the moment. But Nebraska also has a lot of cows and a lot of grazing systems. And one of the things I found when I did some research into calf cows is there's very little comparable systems in the world that we can take research from and apply to Australia. But Sandhills, Nebraska is actually one of those places where they have extensive grazing systems. And they had these herds back in the late 90s, early 2000s that were having real problems with calf cows. They were having mortalities up to 10%. And there was a producer there, or a vet there, that implemented these systems using very similar strategies to minimize exposure that I have just discussed. And they called it the Sandhills calving system. So they had large contiguous paddocks as calving paddocks, and they moved all the pregnant cows into the first paddock. After a week, the pregnant cows were drifted out, leaving the cows with calves in the paddock. And this happened every week because these were large herds, so they had 8 paddocks for 8 weeks of calving, and they basically left the cows and calves behind until there wasn't enough grass for them to eat, and they moved the calving cows out. And so after 5 weeks, they've got different age groups with different throughout each paddock, and they've still got 3 more paddocks to go. And the age range between the calves in that paddock was only 8 days. So they were getting away from those older calves, because what happens is that when calves get calf scours, they will shed those pathogens in volumes for days and weeks after they've got better. And they are often, the older calves are the biggest source of infection to the baby calves. So by doing it this way, they've minimized that effect. And the other golden rule is they don't mix their age groups until all the calves are more than 4 weeks of age, because by then they've got that better immune system and they can then put them all together, and they're less likely to pick up the different bugs that different groups may have. Okay, so how do you apply that on your farm? Well, every farm is going to be different and there's no single best option. You need to get a farm map and plan out how you might do that. Depends on your pasture management, your paddocks, your age of your herds, your calving pattern and the calving season. And it will be very variable from herd to herd. So it's really a question of understanding the principle of trying to minimize the age between the oldest and youngest calf in the group, and to keep baby calves away from calving cows as much as you can. On some farms, you might only need to do this for the heifers because you don't generally get an outbreak in your calves. But you need to be planning this well before calving, because once it gets to calving, you're into crisis management. So what options do you have? You could drift out the cows with calves at foot into an adjacent paddock. Once you've got 3 weeks worth of calves, you start a new paddock. You could drift out the cows yet to calve and put them into mobs, just like they did at Sandhills. And it is important to try and get the cows and calves separated from the calving cows within 2 weeks. Another thing that makes it a lot easier is when you do your pregnancy testing, if you can get your vet or a preg test to tell you which are the lates and earlies, which means you need to preg test early enough to do that. And then if you know which your late and early cows are, you can actually manage them beforehand and keep the late calving cows in a different mob until calving has started and into a couple of weeks of it. And batch mating and synchronizing will also help in that, especially with heifers, because they'll all calve down together and then you'll get a little break. And then if you repeat your synchrony, they'll calve down in another batch. Another way of doing it is just to say, I can't do any of this. I just want to spread my cows out. So in some herds, they actually even mix them in with the sheep or whatever and spread them out all over the farm. So there is a minimal number of animals grouped together, and therefore the impact on the cows, there's less bugs to impact the calves. If you've got a sell or rotational grazing herd, you can run your mob of pregnant cows and pregnant cows and cows together with the newborn calves and keep moving. And you may or may not, in that case, need to drift off your pregnant cows from the cows and calves. Often you do, but I've certainly got herds I work with here that move their calves every couple of days, and because their calves are going to fresh paddocks, they seem to have minimal issues, even though they've got the age range, they don't have the build-up in the paddocks. And this herd here, as you can see on the right-hand side, there's cows due to calve, or there's some of them just calved, and then cows with older calves in an adjacent paddock where obviously that's been grazed for longer. So that's your first principle done, and that's the most important principle. Other ones you want to think about are maximising colostrum intake, calf welfare and nutrition. The most important thing is colostrum. It's really hard to deal with that on a beef herd, but the most common cause of insufficient colostrum is dystocia. So doing all those things to minimise your dystocia. Nutrition is also important to make sure that cows produce adequate colostrum. And another thing that's important is mineral deficiencies, because that will help your immune response, because obviously colostrum gives your calf immunity. And if your cow has got adequate selenium, adequate copper, etc., if that's deficient in your area, then she's going to have a better immune system herself, and she's going to pass that on to the calf. Certainly in the southwest of Western Australia, calf scours is commonly associated with low selenium status. So if you've got a high dystocia rate, then you might want to, if you've got to pull that calf, you actually want to, while you've got the cow in the crush, just get some colostrum into that calf straight away, rather than wandering and waiting. But any calf that hasn't suckled within 6 hours of birth should be supplemented with a litre of colostrum per 20 kilos calf weight. The reason it's 6 hours is that even though the gut is open to let those antibodies through for 24 hours, it is starting to close very rapidly from 6 hours of life. And so if you don't use 6 hours, if you wait for 24 hours, there's a risk the gut is completely closed, or at best, the amount of colostrum the calf will actually absorb will be much, much less. So 6 hours, isn't suckling, isn't up, should get colostrum. Preferably that should be from its dam or from another cow in your herd, rather than bringing in colostrum from an external source. Calving and nursing areas need to be sheltered. They need to be well drained, and they need stress and crowd. You've all noticed baby calves, like baby humans, sleep. And if they're forever being moved and if they're forever being crowded and jostled, then they don't get enough sleep. And it's just like us with not enough sleep. They don't get enough sleep, they get sick. So they need to have that space so they can sleep and go and hide in the grass. So you wonder where they've gone to for the first week of life, and then they'll emerge and they'll be much better then. And the other important thing, I've already said it once, but calves drink. At a week of age, they drink. And if they're getting sick, and they're getting scours, they will be losing fluid into their gut before it shows up as coming out as diarrhea. At that point, they're going to start to drink. If they don't have access to water, either because it's too far away, they can't reach the trough, they can't get down into the dam, or any other reason, but those are the most common ones, then they are much more likely to get sick than they will if they can go to the trough and have a drink, because they often will balance themselves out if it's just a mild case of scours. Vaccination. So vaccine is an aid, but it is only an aid. You've still got to put in place a lot of those management strategies I've discussed, as well as vaccinate your calves. The way it works is you give it to the cows, you give them 2 doses as heifers and then an annual booster, and it increases the protective antibodies in the colostrum and in the milk to specific pathogens. So most of the common calf scour vaccines increase the immunity to rotavirus, coronavirus, and ETEC E. coli, which is one sort of E. coli. One of them also does Clostridium perfringens, which isn't that common in Australia, probably more common in New South Wales. With any of these things, it's important to know whether you've got these pathogens on your farm so that you are using the right vaccine. There are also salmonella vaccines. Salmonellas have strains. So if you have salmonella, you need to know what strain you have. And the one there's not a vaccine for and is still causing a lot of problems is Cryptosporidia. So if you've got a Cryptosporidia as your primary problem, then a vaccine might help because it takes those other things or reduces the level of those other things, but it doesn't make the problem go away. And this is actually nothing to do with calf scour. This is actually Bordetella pertussis, so whooping cough in humans, but it just shows how vaccines work. So vaccines generally do not completely protect. They just help, and they all work in different ways. So the top little wavy line is the herd immunity, is the waxing and waning, which will happen in any herd, which is why you see calf scour some years and not others. And as the herd immunity drops, the incidence, which is the top of the peak, so the amount of cases go up. You put a vaccine in, some vaccines will mean that you still get your disease, but you get it less frequently, and other vaccines work so that you still get your disease as often, but you don't get as much of it. So a vaccine is generally not 100% protective. It is just an aid, and if you're going to need a vaccine, you should also be looking at everything else you should be doing to help prevent the disease. Okay, so that brings me on to diagnostics. 2 important things to know about diagnostics. Firstly, how many should you test? Looks like my little things are going to go and drive themselves. It wasn't meant to happen. If you look at the first calf, if you tested that calf number 1, oh, sorry, don't know what's happened there. Gone into auto drive mode. So if you look at this calf number 3, if you test that one, you're not going to pick up that it's got K99 E. coli. This next one here, you're not going to pick up that the animal's got crypto. And the bottom one, you're not going to pick up, you'll pick up the salmonella, but again, you won't pick up the crypto and the K99. Not sure why that slide is doing that, but I hope you get the point. The point is that you need to test more than one animal. And so when you're picking up when you discuss with your vet to test what you're going to test, there's no point doing a couple. The problem is calf scour diagnostics, even with the calf side dipsticks, which you probably saw on the next slide, is still not cheap. And so it is a relatively significant investment to go and test 6 calves. But if you only test 1 or 2, you're not going to get the whole picture. And you need to look at diagnostics, not just as can I treat this calf and what do I treat it with, but how do I prevent it? Because if you're looking at vaccines, you need to know what you're vaccinating against. If your primary problem is crypto, then a vaccine, as I said, is not necessarily your first answer. And K99 is a very effective vaccine for it. So it's all about knowing prevention, knowing treatment, knowing control, because for each of these pathogens, those things are slightly different, and a vet should be able to give you, so this is this pathogen, you need to focus on these specific things to help minimize disease in your herd. Okay, so going on to this next slide. So diagnosis, I think, is imperative for anyone that's got a real calf scours problem. because it does help with that control and prevention. And so one thing to do is to have a trigger. Say, right, we're going to get more than, we had 20 cows calf last week. 5 of them have got calf scours now. If we get another 25% next week, we better do something about it pretty quickly. Okay, because otherwise, if you leave it too late, half of the calving season's gone already. But as I said, it is costly, so you need to discuss the cost and benefit with your vet. And you need to realise with the calf side test, yes, you can get answers for some things, but it doesn't include salmonella. So you should always send that sample away for salmonella testing as well. Even if it's got 3 pathogens on it, that doesn't mean to say salmonella's not there. Another thing about diagnostics is Australian veterinary labs love to send you back. If you send it off to the vet lab rather than actually getting your diagnosis done with a dipstick, then it doesn't just look for the K99 E. coli, they'll do a culture and sensitivity. And they'll often come back with a pure growth of E. coli. Now, I've been talking to vets about this for 15 years, but there's still some vets that love to say, oh, we've got a coliform outbreak. And what you need to be aware of is that E. coli is in every single feces. It's part of your intestinal tract. You're always going to get coliforms. Even if you get a pure growth of one specific type of E. coli, because when you get calf scours, you get such an upset of the bacteria, you'll often get one E. coli that just overgrows. It's not causing the primary problem, but it's just a reaction to the undigested undigested milk that's in the gut. And so you'll often get a pure growth of E. coli. That doesn't mean to say it's a problem unless you consistently get the same E. coli, and that needs to be typed. The other thing that has been shown is that the E. coli that you will culture in the feces is not the same as in higher up in the gut. So the message we've been trying to get out to vets, and the message I'll put out to producers and everyone else too, is that a pure growth of E. coli on a culture is normal. And most labs in most countries actually don't even report on it. So diagnosis is important. It's important to do everything, and it's important to do at least 6 calves. In some states, you can sometimes get subsidies, especially if you're losing calves. So it's definitely worthwhile talking to your vet in that respect as well. Okay, so dealing with a calf scours outbreak. For whatever reason, your preventive strategies didn't work, you haven't had a problem for years, and now you've got a problem. So where do you start? Well, the first thing is you review all the preventive strategies that I talked about earlier. Then you fence off your heavily used calf camps, or even better, move them out of the paddock they're in, and make sure that the calves have no access to watercourses or surface water in case they're picking up pathogens out of the water. So that's rivers and everything else like that. If you can provide them with an alternative water source, that is a definitely better idea. The other thing to remember is if you're treating sick calves is you need to have good biosecurity. So you need to be using your hand wipes and your 1.5 metre distancing, because you don't quite do that. But what you do is you need to have specific overalls and gloves for treating sick calves, because it's very easy to then go and pull a calf wearing the same clothes. You're taking those bugs into the yards with you, and you're potentially infecting that new baby calf. So always, if you've got to do something with new baby calves, you do that before you do your sick calves. And you always wash your hands, put a pair of overalls on to treat your sick calves, and take them off again before you go and handle any other calves. Preferably, you have a different person for treating sick calves and treating and handling and pulling calves, but that doesn't always happen, obviously. The other place I often see cross-contamination is when people are giving fluid therapy and also feeding colostrum. So if you do sometimes give a newborn calf colostrum, you need a separate feeder to the one you give fluids to with your sick calf, because it's really hard to keep it clean enough and not cross-contaminate at that point. Okay, so way back when, we produced some tips and tools on treating calf scours. They're available on the MLA website. There's one on prevention and one on treating. And these come out of that. So basic principles: is the calf still suckling? Can you catch it? If you can't catch it, it's running around, don't worry about it. It's like kids with snotty noses. Calves need to get runny bums, then they get better. And as long as they're not sick, I wouldn't be worrying about it. But there's a very fine line between dealing with that and dealing with a calf that has gone too far, because they will lose litres of fluids very, very quickly. So if you're worried about calves, you need to be checking them the same day or first thing the next morning, not 2 days down the track. So this is on the tips and tools, but basically, is the calf suckling? Put your fingers down its mouth, seems bright, generally can't catch it, then I'll be leaving it, suckling off its mum, okay? If it's not suckling off its mum, catch it and check its dehydration. I'll talk about that in the next slide. If it's more than 5% dehydrated, it doesn't want to walk, it's not suckling, it's got lots of watery feces, you've got lots of deaths, then you may be considering going to a vet and potentially even going to IV fluid. If it's any of those things are not the case and it's just a bit dehydrated, it's still fairly bright, it will suckle, then you want to give it electrolytes, and you want to give it lots of electrolytes. You can, in that case, leave it with the dam, or what I find much more effective, I'm not a big fan of taking them away, but if you get a calf scours outbreak, is to build a little shelter in the corner of a paddock. I keep meaning to get a photo of one of these. Put a gateway off the corner, put the calves in the little shelter, preferably that's sheltered from the wind as well, and leave it there and come back 4 to 6 hours later, check how it is, give it more fluids, and then let it go with its mum as long as it seems to be improving. You really don't want them to separate them away from the dams, because generally they often get rejected, especially if they're the calves of heifers. So assessing dehydration, this is also in the tips and tools. So if you haven't got one, go and download one. But basically the important cutoffs is to do a skin tent. So you just get the neck and you pull it up into a tent and you let it back down again. And if it's more than 4 seconds, then you've definitely got a problem. And also the other place to look is there any separation between the eyeball and the orbit? So if it's more than 4 seconds, it's definitely dehydrated, it definitely needs fluid, and you can estimate how dehydrated it is. And then you can go and use this table, also from the tips and tools, and work out how much fluid your calf needs. Now, I don't expect anyone to memorize this, but there's 2 things I want you to notice here. One is, this is the daily requirement, and if you've got a 60-kilo calf, it's going to need somewhere between 6 and 10 litres of fluid, not just 2 or 4, okay? Needs a lot, and it will actually need more than that if they're collapsed, okay? If they're more than 5% dehydrated, they need 2 to 4 litres more than this. So this is basically working on what it needs plus how much it's losing plus how dehydrated it is. So on the right, that's my favourite tool, okay? The favourite tool is the 4-litre container that you can use as a tube, not the tiny little 1.8 litre ones. Get a 4-litre one, and you need to start off with one of those, unless it's a really small calf, at which point I'd give it 3 litres, but most calves I treat get 4 litres straight up. And you want to be aiming to get, if you've got to come back again, it wants another 4 litres straight up, because you've got to try and get that 8 litres often into the calf so it rapidly rehydrates. I think one of the most common reasons of calves that don't respond is they're not getting enough fluid. Don't need antibiotics. Some of them do, most of them don't. Most of them need an awful lot more fluids than people are giving them. Okay, so what are you going to use? You're basically going to use electrolytes, and the reason you do that is because it improves water absorption, because it's got sodium in it, it's got glucose in it, and a good electrolyte has specific levels of sodium, potassium, chloride, and glucose. And it's also going to have an alkalizing agent in, because the calf has become a bit acid because it's losing electrolytes through the scours. So that table on the right I have cut off all the trade names, but that is all of the Calf Scour's electrolytes, all of the electrolytes available in Australia. And the green squares mean they meet the requirements. So there's been some really good work done to show exactly what you should be using for the best outcome for your calf. And the reality is, if you just go down to your stock and stage agent, grab what they've got on the shelf, it may well not be the most effective oral electrolyte. And I have found that by using the good ones, I've got farmers that just go, come and give us some more of that stuff. It really works. Okay, so there are some good ones out there. I'm not giving trade names, happy for people to contact me later, but they work really, really well. And it is important that they have the right levels of sodium, potassium, and chloride. It's also important that the alkalizing agent is acetate or propionate, not bicarbonate. A lot of them have bicarbonate in, and the problem with bicarbonate, several problems, one of which is it impacts milk clotting. So if you're using it in a beef calf and you put it back with its mum, it goes and suckles, it then drinks the milk, that goes into the abomasum, the full stomach, it mixes with the bicarb, that stops the milk clotting, the undigested milk goes through to the gut, and you end up with more of a problem because you've got more undigested material there. So some of them have bicarbonate in. They're probably okay as long as you don't put the calf back with the cow. But if you can get one with acetate or propionate, and preferably one that meets all the specifications, they do work a lot better. So important thing, give them enough, give them the right one, and give them milk. So you don't want to hold them off milk for more than 24 hours, and you should only hold them off milk if they don't want it. If a calf wants to drink milk, you should let it have milk. And the main reason for that is the milk is the energy. None of the electrolytes have got enough energy in them. So studies have shown that giving milk as well as all electrolytes, generally not at the same time. It depends on the electrolytes. With the ones I was talking about earlier, they're fine, but if they've got bicarb or citrate, you can't. But if you give milk at a separate time to the electrolytes or let it suckle its mum, then you'll get the same length of illness and mortality rate, but you get better regeneration of the intestinal lining mucosa, which is damaged by the calf scours, and you get less weight loss. So as a rule, if they want to drink milk, let them drink milk. If they don't want to drink milk, that's fine for 24, at the most 36 hours. And if they're going more than 24 hours, there are some energy supplements you can also get that probably help to a little extent. There used to be a really good electrolyte that had energy in it, but currently I don't believe we have one that does that in Australia. Create a temporary shelter so that the cow can see the calf, but the calf's protected from drafts. It can see and smell the calves. The shelter must have water. Anywhere a calf is, has got to have access to water. Move the area where your temporary shelter is around. As I said, my favourite is generally just the gate against the fence in the corner, and fence off that treatment area from other calves once you've used it. Just put a bit of keep your gate there or something else there so that calves aren't going to go and sit in that corner where all the bugs were. If the calves are too sick to remain with their mothers, you sometimes need to remove them away, but the important thing is to get the fluids into them, okay? And you also want to assess the sick calves daily. And the other thing is, if you're giving them 8 or 10 litres of fluids in one end, they are going to keep scouring. Never assess whether the calf is getting better or worse to know how much scour it's producing. You need to be assessing its attitude, whether it wants to suckle, and if it's dehydrated. And if it's not dehydrated, it wants to suckle, it's still scouring, it's going to be doing fine. And your aim should always be to return them within 36 hours and always give them electrolyte feed before they go, so they've got that to support them. Finally, pretty much antibiotics. For many, many years, people want to poke calf scour tablets down the throat and it fixes them. And there is no evidence at all that shows this happens. Most calves with diarrhea don't have a bacterial infection. They may have a bacterial overgrowth, but giving them antibiotics down their throat probably makes that worse, not better. So if you think you need antibiotics, you should be discussing with the vet. And if you've got salmonella or if you have an E. coli coli, then you should be using it. But that's with a veterinary diagnosis. As we go into as you know, what a really big topic for discussion is antimicrobial resistance. And there's increasing evidence that where antimicrobial resistance is an issue in the dairy or in the calf industry or in the cattle industry is when antibiotics are given to calves less than 6 weeks of age, because they don't have a mature gut microbiome and they're much more likely to develop resistant E. coli than an older cow would, or even an older calf would. So giving antibiotics unnecessarily to calves less than 6 weeks of age is far more of a no-no than giving it unnecessarily to an adult cow, in that it's much more likely to give antimicrobial resistance, and that's something we're trying to avoid. The one time I would say, so blanket treatment with everything with antibiotics, no. Antibiotics on diagnosis, yes, if it's a bacteria, and that's another reason why you should do diagnosis. And finally, if you've got really sick, miserable calves, it's quite likely they are septicemic, and on advice from your vet, they probably do need antibiotics, but you should be discussing when to give it with your vet, not just deciding when they need it yourself. So here we go, perfect. When should you contact your vet? If you're unsure as to the correct treatment protocol or which electrolyte to use, there's really good information out there as to what are the best electrolytes. If you're getting calves that you've given them that 8 litres plus of fluids and they're still not sucking or not improving, if they've got blood in their feces or if they're dying, because it could well be a salmonella at that point or something else more significant, and if you've carried out your recommended prevention treatment measures but your calves are still slow to improve or still dying. And so I'd like to finish there, Hilary, and just to finish again on the Sandhills calving system. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much for that, Alison. That was a great presentation, really thorough, and I think, well, I certainly got a lot out of it, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I just wonder, Alison, could you duck back to, it was early on, the slide 15, develop a risk-based protocol for the production system. You just dropped out, and I think we missed the key message of that slide. If you could just go over it again. That'd be great.
Way back.
Yes.
Was it that one there? Hang on. I skip past it. That one or the next one?
Before that, so that one. Yep, that one.
Yeah. Okay, so what I was saying is that, and you probably understand this slide better now that people have actually seen all the prevention that we're talking about, is that prevention can be time consuming and costly, as can treatment. And so you need to actually say, what is my risk? And a bit later on, I go and talk about the kind of risk levels you might be implementing things with. There's plenty of people that don't worry about calf scours. In fact, you know, I've been in this area for 5 years and I haven't done a lot of calf scours in the last 3 years.
Oh, Alison, it must be the slide you've just dropped off again. Oh dear. All right, I'll just wait a few seconds. Alison, you've just we've dropped out again, so maybe just go check that bandwidth.
Yes.
While all right, while Alison is doing that, I'll give her a bit of a break. If you do have to head off now, please do take the time to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. This survey provides feedback for us at Home Sacket and presenters such as Alison, as well as MLA, to make sure these webinars are, you know, hitting the correct notes. This is our second last webinar for this series. We do have another one next week with John Webb Ware on retaining older ewes, and then after that we will be having a little bit of a break and then coming back mid to late August with the next lot of contracted webinars. So how did you go there, Alison?
I have checked the children and no one is on the internet, so I'm not sure. Is that better or not?
Yeah, that's better now. Sorry.
I don't know why it's doing this. As I said, I think the platform seems to require more oomph than some of the others do. Maybe I'm not really sure, but anyhow, we will see how we go.
All right, we'll just duck into some questions.
Do you want to run over that slide again, or did you get the gist of it?
Maybe do it again. We'll give it a go and then see. Yeah, just run over it again if you could, Alison.
So all I was saying is that when you're looking at the preventive measures, you need to consider what is the risk in your herd for calf scours, because there's a massive variation in the risk and the level of occurrence. So you need to consider how often is calf scours a problem, how often do I get it, how much of a problem is it, and your herd immunity will wax and wane, as I was showing you later. There's also obviously a seasonal variation from year to year. Some years everyone gets calf scours just because it's hot and wet or whatever. And you need to be looking at, even if you get some calves with diarrhea, is it really causing an impact on them? And so you think about all those things. You then put a level of risk and a value of the proposed control measures, which I then went on to discuss. And you say, what's my risk? What's the value of those proposed control measures, and look at the economics. And you might find out that some of the proposed control measures are more expensive than actually the calf scours is costing you. So you've got to look at all these things as what's the cost benefit of it, really. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you for going back over that, Alison. Someone has written in. No, you're right. Someone's just written in, does the fact that coronavirus causes scouring explain the panic buying of toilet paper? So there you go.
I can tell you, I was looking at the coronavirus from a very early stage, saying I know a lot about coronavirus in cattle and I don't like this. So possibly.
Oh dear. All right. So the first question from Jade, which is a bit broad, so I might just drill it down into one. She's asked, will this also work with dairy cows? So maybe if we could just ask the question, is there anything significantly different between dairy calves and beef calves with regards to scours?
No. Put those similar principles in it. So put those principles in place. Where doesn't matter what sort of calf it is. You just need to work out how to adapt it to your herd. Okay. And with dairy cattle, the only other thing, and this obviously isn't what we're really talking about, with dairy cows, there are a couple of other preventive options available, because there's preventive treatments you give orally, which you can't give to a beef calf very easily without catching it every day, and it's not worth the stress.
Excellent, thank you. And the next question is actually about those preventative or those treatments that you put up. Just asking for the names of them. So if they Google Alison Gunn Herd Solutions, can they find your contact details, Alison, to give you a call or an email about those treatment products?
Probably, or shall I just give out my email address now? Happy to do that.
Yes, if you like. Do you have a slide there with it on?
As my website is currently being no, but I can probably find one in a minute. If you want me, it's very easy. It's yep. a.gunn, so a.gunn.vet@gmail.com.
All right. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry, I should have had it on.
Yeah. No, that's fine. The next question, how can I minimize the risk of scours with bought-in calves for rearing?
Yep, that is a good one. And it's not easy. I think the most important thing is to buy them from a single known source where you ensure they get adequate colostrum. If you're buying different young calves from different farms, you're much more likely to get a problem. Give them fluids when they arrive. keep them on fluid probably your first 12 hours and keep them separated. Any other animal probably for at least a week, so you can see if they're going to scours. But certainly there is a much higher risk of scours, and the dairy beef industry or that sort of thing there's lots of other protocols out there, but they're the most important things. Colostrum, if they've had a good colostrum and you can ensure that really helps. And then make sure they got water and adequate feed. Certainly if you're buying them, and the other thing I would say is there's a really big move in the feed, if you're talking rearing calves, to going away from just giving them 2 litres twice a day, and for the first 4 weeks they need to get a lot more milk. You'll get a lot better growth rates. Again, happy to take questions by email on that.
Thank you. The next one, we are routinely getting scours in calves at 12 weeks of age. It goes through all the calves, same at 2 different properties. What is the likely pathogen?
That's why you've got to do a test. I would be starting with looking for coccidia in that, because they're that bit older. And occasionally you can get older problems with rotavirus, but coccidia, so even they'll pick up a coccidia on, could even possibly get worms, okay? For instance, Barber's poleworm only really causes a problem in very young calves. It doesn't cause a problem in older calves. So worms and coccidia.
Thank you. Yes, you can get a copy of these, or you can watch a replay of this webinar. It'll be available on the MLA website, hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow. So that's where you can watch a replay of this. The next question, can you tell if a calf has scours by the colour and consistency?
Often with a beef calf, it's hard because you can't, it's not like a dairy calf in a pen. But look for hair loss around the bum, look for hair loss around the anus, scours or diarrhea on the tail. So yeah, because colour and consistency, but it's very watery, it's often a bit hard to see it's there. So they're generally looking a bit mopey as well at that point.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Dominic. Next one from Andrew. Can you explain skin tenting regarding to dehydration, please, and the best site to test it?
So the best site is on the neck. It's explained in the tips and tools, but the best site is on the neck, and basically you just pinch up the skin and you let it drop back and you count or time until it goes back to completely flat.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, Alison, just say that again.
Did I drop out, or you just
a little bit? Yeah, just that very last sentence that you had.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, I think because you just said thank you, so I think I stopped. All I was saying was that, yeah, so you tent up your skin and you let it drop back and count, and you do it on the neck. And it's explained in the tips and tools, the treating calf scours tips and tools.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the next one from Jan. Alison, with respect to the 4-litre liquid dispenser, what is the decontamination process? Do I need extra tubes?
No, as long as you clean it. Well, I'd have extra tubes if you're going to use it for calf scours and then use it for colostrum. But apart from that, I would be, if you're tubing more than one, you probably want some soapy water. The important thing when you're cleaning anything is physical cleaning. So if you can get, you can get like a long bottle brush that goes down the tube. So if you can get a long skinny bottle brush that goes down the tube, clean it out. Try and give it a good rinse out between calves, especially the outside of it, because obviously that's the most contaminated bit. And then when you finish tubing your calves, you then take it back and you want to probably use a bit of bleach in your water as well as some detergent to clean it. Make sure you hang it up and it dries before you go and use it again.
Right, great, thank you. The next one from Darren. Is the risk profile in general for autumn calvers different to spring calvers?
The surveys that I did and the general understanding is that yes, you'll generally get more calf scours in the spring because it's colder and wetter. So it really depends on the weather. If you get a wet autumn, you might get more calf scours, but generally, yes, you do get less calf scours in autumn, and that is one reason why people calve in the autumn. Obviously, it then doesn't match their pasture growth curve. So these are all the decisions you need to be making.
All right, excellent. Thank you for the question, Darren. The next one from Jane. Is there anything you can give a calf to make up for having missed colostrum at the right time?
Really, no. But if they haven't got enough colostrum, they don't necessarily die. In fact, generally they don't. They just have an increased risk of dying. So the important thing is if you know they haven't had enough colostrum, and management allows, okay, they're not with the mum with the rest of the herd, then you put it somewhere where there is a low, all those other things are less risky. So you keep it with a small group of animals with a very small age group, that sort of thing, to try and minimize its actual chance of getting infection, and it will develop its own immunity within 4 to 6 weeks. You can, the other thing is that there are overseas some colostrum products, and occasionally they pop up on the Australian market, but I haven't seen, I'm not aware of one currently available that has enough colostrum in it or enough antibodies in it to make a significant difference.
Great, thank you, Jane. The next one from Tony. How is the pathogens, how are they mostly contracted? So is it airborne? Do they get it from the mud on the udder or from licking the ground, etc.?
So most of them come from feces, so udder or snuffling around on the ground. Coronaviruses are airborne, so they will go across fences, and that's why they went throughout the Diamond Princess, and the air conditioning system would be my guess, but I don't know for sure. Pestivirus, yeah, maybe a little bit of airborne there too. So, but most of them, and Salmonella is shed in saliva. In fact, the other thing I should say, because we had a calf scour conference about 15 years ago now, and a lot of the vets there, including myself, had managed to infect children. And the way I did it is that I ended up with having to hold a calf as I was running out the door of a vet clinic for about 2 minutes, and it dribbled all down my leg, I'm guessing, and then I had a little child that liked to cling onto mum's leg. So saliva is definitely a risk, and certainly with your crypto and with your salmonella, you need to be aware that they are zoonotic, and you shouldn't be having young children near scouring calves or immunocompromised people.
Wow, great. Thank you for that, Alison. That's quite interesting. All right, the next one from Jan. Does giving vitamin A, D, and E at birth help with the scours at all?
Not that I have seen any research, no. There is sometimes when you might want to give it, if the cows, if I was going to give AD&E, I would be giving AD&E in a very dry season when there's no green grass to cows pre-calving potentially, but not to the calf.
All right, thank you. Next one from Dominic. Apart from electrolytes, is there anything else we can use to help calves with crypto?
There is a preventive, but it has to be given for 7 days from birth. So really, and crypto is hard because it recurs, so that you get what's called auto-infection, where the calf seems to get better and gets worse again because the Cryptosporidia sporulate, and then they actually are still in the gut and they reinfect the gut. So nothing that will actually, that's registered in Australia that is effective and that kills crypto that you can use in cattle. No, it's just a question of trying to keep them as rehydrated as you can and minimize them getting it in the first place. And it's definitely the hardest one to deal with.
Thank you. The last question I've got here, so if you do have one, get it in quickly. Again from Dominic, would giving calves a probiotic like BioCalf make a difference to calf scours?
There is increasing information coming out in published scientific publications of the benefit of, like, as we get to understand the gut microbiome, which we probably didn't even know about 10 years ago, and that's in humans and in calves. There's definitely some benefits being shown by some research of some probiotics, but not. It's a question of, has that probiotic got the research? So they're certainly not harmful, and they could be beneficial, but there's some out there that have been shown to be beneficial, and there's some out there that haven't got the research behind them. And I don't know that particular one.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jacqueline has just got in, would giving colostrum to scouring older calves be helpful?
Probably yes, if they're happy to drink. In that, assuming that you're not buying, so it depends where the colostrum's coming from. If we're talking a beef herd, okay, which I'm figuring is predominantly what we've got. If I had dairy calves, absolutely, because there's colostrum, even though the first calf colostrum has got the most antibodies in it, the cow will produce antibodies in her milk for a while after calving, and certainly in the first 3 to 4 days. And so the level of antibodies will decrease, but it still has a protective local effect on the gut, even though they can't be absorbed. However, if I had a beef herd, I would not be purchasing in colostrum, because colostrum is a great medium for bugs to grow. And I've seen all sorts of outbreaks of quite a number of bugs associated with feeding colostrum. And in the dairy industry, they pool it. So you get one cow that comes in, and it basically is shedding salmonella or something else, and then that milk gets put in a vat with some other cows' colostrum, and then it's fed to 20 calves, and then there's enough salmonella to infect all 20 calves. So colostrum is a massive biosecurity risk unless it's been pasteurised, and there is some dairies that are pasteurised in colostrum now, so if you can find one of those, maybe. But otherwise, I would not be advocating people taking colostrum off a dairy farm, because you might just be getting more bugs than you started with, or in any farm.
Thank you. And the last one from Jane, who just would like to ask if you have any comments on how to manage rejected calves, especially twins.
Hard, isn't it? It is not easy, unless, I think the easiest way to manage them is if another cow's calf, dies at birth, is to probably foster it, and potentially even to skin that, calf that's born at birth, and put the skin on the calf that you need to foster. Seems to work quite well. So yeah, they're really hard. It's when they've got twins any other way. The other thing I think you can do is put them in the yards and make the cow make that calf suckle for 10 days or so, and sometimes they'll take it, but it's a lot of work.
All right, thank you for answering that. Thanks for the question, Jane. And just a reminder for those who have written in again, these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website, and will be available by tomorrow afternoon, hopefully, if not Monday. So pretty quick turnaround for you to watch again, or if you missed a part and want to watch that section, that's great. And obviously Alison has given her email, which was a.gun with 2 N's, .vet@gmail.com. Was it, Alison? Is that right?
Yep, correct. Yep.
Great. So if you want to be in contact with Alison about this topic, and obviously there's no one better to give some information on calf scours, so I'm sure she'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you had. So on that note, thank you very much for your presentation tonight, Alison. A few little glitches with the audio, but not to worry, it didn't hinder the presentation at all. I think we definitely all got out what we needed. And yes, thank you for presenting, and good night, everyone.
Good night, and sorry about the audio. I don't know, it was working earlier, as we know, Hilary, so it's a bit frustrating. I'm sorry. So,
No worries.
good night, everybody.